And welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and I am talking about the crazy green enchantments that we have out there that we could be using in the Commander format that might be very helpful. I started out talking about some red enchantments that I thought were just absolutely wacky and crazy, and I've decided to do all the other colors as well. I love doing research into all these old wacky cards, and part of it is, hey, look at all these weird, funny cards that do these out of the ordinary things, but also it's how can we actually use this in a Commander game, right? So let's start out with Arborea, 2 green world enchantment. And interestingly enough, this card actually was just reprinted in Dominaria Remastered. That's pretty interesting. So you can get a nice new updated version of this card if you want to. I won't go into what a world enchantment does. I made a video all about world enchantments where I go deeper into that. There is an interesting interaction there if you want to check that out. What does this card do though? Creatures can't attack a player unless that player cast a spell or put a non-token permanent onto the battlefield during their last turn. This is a very weirdly worded, very interesting pillow fort type of effect that affects everybody, right? That's what world enchantments do. They affect the whole table. So anyone can use this card, and what's going to happen is if on your turn, if you don't want to be attacked, say your opponent has a giant army, you can just not cast a spell or not put a non-token permanent onto the battlefield. So in other words, you can't even play a land, because if you play a land, you're now put a permanent onto the battlefield, which means you're open to attacking. If you don't want to be attacked, you just sit there not doing anything. I guess you can create tokens. If you have a way to create a token without casting a spell, you're good to go. So maybe it will fit in a deck like that, in a deck where you have a commander that is creating tokens, something like that. This is a very unique, interesting card. It's a pillow fort type of card in green. Works for your opponents as well, but I very much doubt they're going to be using it because, again, it is incredibly difficult to not cast a spell or have a non-token permanent enter the battlefield on your turn. Can you take advantage of this card? I think this is one that actually might be able to fit in some decks. Next up, we have Freyalise's Winds, 2 green enchantment. Whenever a permanent becomes tapped, put a wind counter on it, right? So any permanent becoming tapped, lands, creatures, artifacts, whatever, you're going to put a wind counter on it. If a permanent with a wind counter on it would untap during its controller's untap step, remove all wind counters from it instead. So this is a replacement effect, and it's one of those effects that happens during untap, which you don't see very often. So essentially what this card does is it makes everything untap half as much as it normally would, right? So if you look at a Vorinclex, I guess it would be a similar sort of effect there with the way it affects your opponents, right? Whenever your opponent taps a land, it doesn't untap during their next untap step. Freyalise's Winds is going to do something similar, right? Because every time something gets tapped, it puts a wind counter on it, and then when you get to your next untap step, instead of untapping it, you remove the wind counter, and then on the following untap, it will untap normally, of course, because it doesn't have a wind counter on it. So this is a very interesting Staxy effect in green. Again, just like with the Pillow Fort thing, we don't see a lot of stacks effects in green, and this is a really interesting one because first of all, it, I think, just slows the game down. This is not like a hardcore stacks effect that is just going to keep everything tapped down. It is a slow down sort of effect is how I look at it. But also because it's using the win counters, that means that you can manipulate the outcome here. You can remove the win counters so that your stuff untaps normally. So that's a way that you can maybe get around this ability. It's a really interesting card. It's doing that Staxy thing, but in a very interesting way. Does it fit in any decks? I guess if you have a green Stax deck, this is a great include. Another great include if you're doing a green Staxy or Pillow Fort type of effect is Song of Serenity. This is such an interesting, unique card. I have mentioned it in my 10 card series because I actually think this is really, really good against certain decks. 1 in a green enchantment. Creatures that are enchanted can't attack or block. Very interesting card. Again, you wouldn't normally see this kind of effect in green. It's hating on auras essentially, right? If a creature is enchanted, it can't attack or block. Now, obviously, that is incredibly good against those kinds of decks. The bad part here is, are you going to be playing against one of those decks? This one for me is a very group specific type of card. If you got that guy in your play group who is doing a Boros or an equipment or something like that, this is going to be a fantastic card. Maybe you've lost one too many times to their Voltron Ural deck and you're sick and tired of it. This is a card that will completely shut down down a deck like that. Not a lot of fun for them, but not a lot of fun to be one-shotted by a Ural that you can't target either, right? So this one, though unique and interesting, you don't see this kind of stuff in green a lot, I would say is more specifically for certain situations where you want to be dealing with something that your buddy is doing in your play group. Another interesting enchantment here, a little bit newer, a little bit more modern, right? This is actually printed in the modern era. So for me, I consider that to be a little bit newer of a card. Hum of the Radix, 2 green enchantment. Each artifact spell costs 1 more to cast for each artifact its controller controls. That's a really powerful effect. In fact, that's an incredibly powerful effect against certain decks. Every time your opponent casts an artifact, they're going to have to count the artifacts they have in play already and add that to the mana cost of whatever they're casting, right? That is really going to shut down a lot of artifact decks. And in fact, a lot of decks in general, this card could be great in. I had a patron play this against me in a game, and they weren't specifically hating on any strategy at all. They just didn't have any artifacts in their deck, so they thought they would give this card a try, and man, it really slows a lot of decks down. Again, it is sort of that Staxy sort of effect in green that you don't normally see. Almost every single deck in the Commander format plays artifacts, of course, Mana Rocks being the most common one, and this is going to hurt just about every deck, right? Even just a little bit, it is going to hurt it. Now, green deals with artifacts really well, which is why this card probably doesn't really see any play in the format. But if you don't think about it as I'm dealing with artifacts, you think about it as just slowing your opponents down, right? Against the treasure token deck, your opponent's got a bunch of treasures in play. They pretty much just can't cast artifacts at all. There's a lot of really powerful, useful artifacts in the format that don't fit the artifact theme, like a Lightning Greaves, right? If your opponent's Lightning Greaves costs 5 or 6 mana now, are they going to cast it? Against an equipment deck, this is incredible because, of course, your opponent's going to have lots of equipment in play, and every equipment they cast is going to cost so much more. Really interesting card. Next up, we got Overlaid Terrain, 2 green enchantment. As overlaid terrain enters the battlefield, sacrifice all lands you control. That's pretty brutal, but lands you control have tap, add 2 mana of any color. So what this does is it doubles all of the mana that your lands produce, right? They can add 2 mana of any one color. So it is mana fixing, of course, but it is also doubling the amount of mana you have. Now, we have a lot of mana doublers in the format already. This is just going to be a cheaper version. Is it worth it? You have to sacrifice all your lands. I suppose where this might be a good fit, and I'm sure there might be some people in the comments telling me there is a deck that they have this in, is one where you want to be sacrificing your lands anyway, I guess, or you can play them from your graveyard, some effect like that. This would be a really neat combo with a card that I think you could build an entire deck around, Realm Raiser, which is going to exile all lands. So you exile all lands, then you play your Overlaid Terrain, and of course, all your lands have been exiled. You don't have to worry about sacrificing them. And then when your Realm Raiser dies, your lands come back into play, and now they all tap for double mana. It's a little bit of hoops to jump through just to get double mana. Nevertheless, really interesting card. Are there people using it? I've never seen it before in a game myself, but I imagine there are some people that have this in their commander decks and they're using it in a very specific way. Next up, Ritual of Subdual. Again, another card that is just doing something that we never ever see in green. 4 green enchantment. Has cumulative upkeep too. If a land is tapped for mana, it produces colorless mana instead of any other type. That is a really powerful effect, obviously, in a commander game. It is even more powerful, I would say, than a Blood Moon, right? A Blood Moon is going to give you red mana, so any deck that already has red isn't going to be hurt nearly as much. This is only allowing colorless mana. Any land tap for mana is only going to add colorless. That shuts down a lot of decks. Again, just a very powerful effect that we never typically see in green. Green doesn't usually go after lands like this. Now, where are you going to use this? I guess you could probably use it in almost any green deck, especially if that green deck has mana dorks, right? If you have a green deck that has mana dorks, this is only affecting lands. Your mana dorks are still going to produce mana normally. It's got that cumulative upkeep. I like that they used to put stuff like that on cards. I like having upkeeps on powerful cards because it puts pressure on that player to keep it in play rather than they just play it and it's up to their opponents to try to get it off the table, right? Here, you have to keep playing the cumulative upkeep, but but you've already got at least 6 mana. You could probably keep it on the table for a while. And again, similar to the Freyalise' wins, I see this as just slowing the game down, right? Your opponents can still tap their mana rocks and their mana dorks to add colored mana. I don't mind cards like this at all in a commander game because I just see it as slowing things down a little bit. You're just not letting your opponents do exactly what they want. They have to make some specific choices before they do so because they probably have a very limited amount of colored mana to use, right? So I don't mind cards like this in a game at all. I know people don't like any type of stacksy effect. I don't consider the stacks at all, but any effect that is going to slow you down or encumber you from doing what you want to be doing in your deck. I know people don't like that. I think it's an integral part of the game, personally. I don't think you can just let people go crazy and do whatever they want with their decks. Slowing people down or stopping them from what they're doing is a really important part, and this is an interesting card that will do so. Next up, Drop of Honey. Really old card, and this is a really, really expensive one because unfortunately it has not been reprinted, and it is incredibly unique. I will say, though, it has sort of been reprinted in a different color, Porphyry Nodes, and the reason why, of course, is because it isn't doing what green normally does. The reprinted version, Porphyry Nodes, was printed in Planar Chaos, and they specifically did this in Planar Chaos. Really interesting thing they did there, where they took these older cards that were doing something that was really outside of the color pie. It wasn't typically what you see in that color, and they reprinted the card doing the same thing in the color that you would normally see it. And of course, white is more known for doing effects like this. At the beginning of your upkeep, destroy the creature with the least power. It can't be regenerated. If 2 or more creatures are tied for the least power, you choose one of them. So like, what? Huh? How is that a green effect? You never see an effect in green that is destroying creatures. Very weird. But when there are no creatures on the battlefield, you sacrifice Drop of Honey. So basically, this is going to keep going. Every single upkeep, you're going to choose the creature with the least power and destroy it. And then the next upkeep and the next upkeep and the next upkeep until there's no creatures on the battlefield. And then this goes away. This is just such a unique effect in green. I'm trying to think of any cards in green that destroy creatures. There really isn't any. I mean, you have Beast Within, which destroys a permanent, but not specifically creatures. Just having a green card that specifically says destroy a creature is incredibly rare. Having one that sits on the battlefield doing it repeatedly, of course, this is just a completely unique effect in the game of Magic. Really powerful card too, only cost 1 mana. Again, I see it as sort of a slow the game down sort of effect, where on turn 1, I could just drop this, assuming a creature has already been played. I'm obviously not going to play this if there's no creatures in play because it'll immediately get sacrificed. My opponent plays a creature, I cast this for 1 green mana. On my next upkeep, I will destroy the creature that they've played, and probably all my other opponents aren't going to play creatures, right? Because they're just going to want to wait until this gets off the battlefield. So it's going to slow down the early game. That's sort of how I see this card being used, because people probably aren't going to want to play creatures into it, right? This card really is incredibly unique in green. We just never see cards like this. Similarly, Cyclone, 2 green enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, put a win counter on Cyclone. Again with the win counters, that's interesting. Then sacrifice Cyclone unless you pay green for each win counter on it. So interestingly enough, early in the days of Magic, hurricanes and cyclones and stuff like that were seen as a green thing, right? Which kind of sort of think of them as blue things, but the whole idea was hurricanes and cyclones kill flying creatures, and green needed a way to deal with flying creatures. So that's kind of why they went in that direction. Nevertheless, if you pay, Cyclone deals damage equal to the number of win counters on it to each creature and each player. So this is such an incredibly unique card in green. And this is one that, even though it's wacky and you don't really see this effect in green, I think this is actually really good. So first of all, this sort of has cumulative upkeep, right? You're putting a win counter on it, and then you're paying a green mana for each win counter on it. It's essentially the exact same thing as cumulative upkeep. Instead of an age counter, you're putting a win counter. So you pay the cumulative upkeep, then if you do, you get the effect. And the effect is you're going to deal damage to every creature, not just the flying creatures, every creature in play, and each player as well. That can be really, really good in certain decks. I'm looking at you, Jared Carthalion, who wants to have damage dealt to him repeatedly, right? That's the advantage here. I want my creatures to be having damage dealt to them, but you also are getting the added benefit of your dealing damage, of course, to your opponents and to your opponent's creatures as well. So you're constantly sort of wiping the board while dealing damage to your own creatures. And in green, you just never, ever see this. This is a really entirely unique effect in green. And if you got lots of mana, which green decks typically do, you can just keep this going forever, keeping the board wiped. Again, you can almost use it as a pillow fort sort of effect where you're just constantly killing all the creatures and nobody can really get going. You're killing the players as well, so you got to be careful with that part. But I think there probably is some decks out there that could use this card. Next up, we got Symbiotic Deployment, another really interesting card that I mentioned in my 10 cards videos. 2 and a green enchantment. Skip your draw step. That seems really, really bad, right? However, pay 1 and tap 2 untapped creatures you control to draw a card. That's a really powerful effect. It's an interesting one. You do have to be really, really careful with this card though, because of course it's skipping your draw step and you can actually sort of lock yourself out of the game, right? If you don't have any creatures to tap and draw a card, like someone casts a board wipe, you can get to a situation where you don't have any removal in your hand and you can't get it off the table and now you're just completely done. Where I think this card is great and where you can get into the situation where you don't have to be worried about being locked out of the game is, again, those commanders that are creating tokens, right? If you have a commander that creates tokens, your commander, of course, is creature number 1. The token that your commander is creating is creature number 2. So now you're guaranteed to always have at least 2 creatures to tap. And then, of course, if you're in a really go wide strategy, you can completely go nuts with this. I had this in my Shanna deck because that's what my Shanna deck did. Again, it's kind of a dangerous option sometimes, but I just really love super interesting cards like this, so I wanted to give it a try. I get tons of tokens in play. I can slap down my Symbiotic Deployment and then just start tapping down all my creatures to draw a ton of cards. Later in a game, I think it can be good. Again, it's really dangerous because you're skipping your draw step, obviously. Maybe in like a Damia Sage of Stone deck where you're already skipping your draw step, it might be a good include as well. It's a really interesting card. See if this might be a good fit in any of your decks. And I will end off with one of the most interesting cards I have ever seen. A super interesting green enchantment. Really one of the most unique ones I think there is out there. The most unique one I came across anyway. Let's see if we can find a place for this card. Splintering Wind. 2 green enchantment. Pay 2 and a green. Okay, so first of all, this is an enchantment that is just going to sit on the battlefield and it's not going to do anything. Unlike most enchantments, enchantments usually do something when they hit the table. They have some global effect. This isn't going to do anything. It's just going to sit there and it has an activated ability. So you can cast this at any time and it just sits there until you activate this ability, right? So you pay 2 and a green. Splintering Wind deals 1 damage to target creature. That's pretty good. So you can just pay 3 mana at any time to deal 1 damage to a creature. Again, we're already in a situation where it's like, okay, this is not doing anything that we normally see in green. Green isn't throwing damage around. It's not pinging. Again, this is not just flying creatures. This is any creature, right? However, it gets a lot weirder. When you activate this ability, okay, so you've now dealt 1 damage to target creature, also going to create a 1/1 green splinter creature token. Okay, well, this is all upside so far, right? We're only paying 3 mana. We're dealing 1 damage to a creature and we get this splinter creature token as well. That seems pretty good. It also has flying, but it also has cumulative upkeep 1 green. Okay, well, that's not great. Now we have this token creature in play, but we have to pay the cumulative upkeep for it. Still, that sounds like all upside to me. However, when it leaves the battlefield, it deals 1 damage to you and each creature you control. Okay, that's pretty bad, right? That sort of makes sense of all the benefits that you're getting here. You're going to pay 3 mana. You're going to deal damage to any target creature. You're going to create this splinter token. It has flying and cumulative upkeep, but when it leaves the battlefield, it's going to deal damage to you and every other creature you control. Where are you going to be using this card? This is such an interesting card. I suppose if you have an effect that prevents the damage to you and creatures you control, then you get around the downside. There are cards that will prevent like non-combat damage to you and creatures you control, or, there's lots of effects like that out there where you maybe could be using this. Maybe you don't care about the damage, again, because you're in that Jared Carthelian deck. How are you going to use this card? This is such a unique and interesting card. You're throwing damage around, you're creating these flying splinter tokens, but when they leave the battlefield, they're dealing damage to you and all your other creatures. You can crank out a whole bunch of these maybe, right? You can just go off, create a whole bunch of these tokens, but now you have to pay the cumulative upkeep for all of them. And if you don't, they'll leave the battlefield and then deal a bunch of damage to you. If all the creatures you have in play are just the splinter tokens, then you'll get into sort of a cascading effect here where one splinter dies, it deals damage to the rest, and then they die and then deal more damage. And, it's sort of this cascading damage effect that sort of happens. So you got to be careful there. Such a interesting, unique card. I've tried a few times to fit this card in decks. Again, in this theme where you want to be dealing damage to yourself or your creatures, it might fit. Where are you going to use it? Let me know in the comments below if you guys guys have a neat place for this card, or if you might actually be using it already. It's an incredibly unique card, no doubt about it. Let me know in the comments below about all of these enchantments if you guys are currently using them. There's some really interesting ones here. Just wild and crazy things some of them are doing, and certainly a lot of them are doing things that we just never ever see in green. And in the Commander format, that can be incredibly important, right? Because maybe you want to be building a Staxy or Pillow Fort type of deck in green, and I gave you a lot of suggestions here for that, right? If you guys want to build a mono green Stax or Pillow Fort deck, there's actually a fair amount of options here that might fit. And if you are thinking of purchasing any of these cards by chance, I do have a TCG player link. It is in the description below. Give it a click. It helps support the channel. But that is it for today, and thanks for tuning in.